Greetings and salutations, friends. We are finally back after a bit of a more protracted hiatus than I had originally anticipated, what with my headset imploding. But we are finally back again. Now, usual scheduled broadcasting will be resuming next week, but for the moment, I figured I'd start on a series of a slightly more focused lore videos, slightly shorter and slightly more to the point. Today we are going to be talking about technology in the Warhammer world, or perhaps more correctly, the lack of technology in the Warhammer world. Now, as a few of you might already be familiar with, the primary technological power of the Warhammer world is the Dwarves of the World Edge Mountains. Now, even that isn't saying much. Granted, the technology of the Dwarfs is a little bit of a, how should I say, well, it's had quite a few iterations. In earlier versions of Warhammer, there were mentions of golems, powered by some kind of runic magic, capable of some base level of sentience and able to, accept simple instructions like beat the shit out of that man or lift that heavy thing. Not particularly complicated stuff, but nevertheless, more or less sentient robots, which is a wee bit above the level of their current day tech, which is more or less restricted to the level of steam engines. However, here's the thing. Most of the mentions of these golems are either from novels or from very, very old army books, so whether or not any of these golems are actually still canon is not entirely easy to judge. Personally, considering the heights of the dwarf power before the Great War of the Beards, I wouldn't put it past the bearded little bastards to manage to craft some kind of runic-powered golem, but they clearly were not produced in any great quantity, so that was, in all due likelihood, the absolute pinnacle of dwarven engineering before the War of the Beards reduced them severely, both in numbers, resources, and, spare time, really, as simple as that. During times of peace, of course, the dwarves were freer to innovate, to experiment, and try new things. With constant hordes of greenskins and chaos bastards pushing down their doors, they tend to have more important things to worry about. But back to the point, shall we? Now, as far as we are able to determine with any vague certainty, the first steam engine appears to have been developed after the War of the Beards. It seems to have popped up somewhere in the Imperial calendar of 1100 after Sigmar's, so quite a while after the War of the Beards. Now, this is a little bit interesting, considering the fact that in some of the books we have detailing the War of the Beards, there are mentions of all kinds of dwarven marvels. I mean, they hollowed out mountains and built statues 20-30 meters tall. How the hell did they do this without steam engines? I mean, they could create simple leverage systems, the wonderful little medieval version, which is literally a man in a hamster wheel that's capable of lifting heavy things. Possible. I mean, dwarves are sturdy little folk, and they could certainly operate such a wheel and lift extremely heavy blocks of stone like that, but even so, it seems a little bit extreme. On the other hand, though, you also have to bear in mind that back then the dwarves were far more, I suppose we should say, magically advanced than they are now. The art of rune crafting and the crafting of runic weapons and tools were far more commonplace. And if you have a magical pickaxe that is incredibly good at cutting a rock, then maybe you wouldn't need steam engines. The arts of dwarven rune magic, a lot of it has been lost to us as to the exact specifications of how a lot of this works, but considering they can create weapons that require virtually no maintenance in the way of sharpening and keening, it doesn't seem like that much of a stretch to assume that they could make a magical pickaxe or a magical shovel, and that would make work a hell of a lot easier. But as we don't have all that much information about that time, we are going to be returning back to the current date of the Warhammer world, where the dwarves have created a fair few mechanical marvels. For example, the dwarven airship is now more or less canon, as it has been mentioned in several novels at this point, although the novels are kind of conflicted on whether or not there is a single working prototype of a proper airship, or a blimp more precisely, or if it is a relatively well-known design that just hasn't been utilized much. It's a little hard to determine, really. And of course, we have stuff like the Dwarven Ironclads. Well, the Dwarf Ironclads are certainly seaworthy, but they do have a somewhat nasty tendency of, well, sinking in rough weather, which is not ideal, but nevertheless they are seafaring vessels with a relatively high chance of getting back to port, and they are of course fantastic inland vessels where they don't have to worry all too much about storms and weather conditions. And frankly, there's not really all that many races in the Warhammer world that could possibly take on a dwarf ironclad in inland seas, like the area outside the dwarf port of Barak Var, for example. However, bear in mind that ironclads they may be, but they are very early ironclads, most of the time only armed with 2 or 3 cannons at most, and crewed by a bunch of dwarfs, granted, but still quite vulnerable to getting overrun. The Skaven have in fact had a semi-successful, by Skaven standards, naval engagements with the dwarfs of Barak Var. Now, Skaven's lost, miserably, but considering it was ironclads versus, well, rafts, it's an impressive military achievement that they even managed to put up a fight. But of course, the ironclad is not the only mechanical marvel to have popped out of Barak Var. The Dwarf Submersibles, or Nautilus as they have been called in some sources, well, they're essentially a submarine, although, well, calling it a submarine might be a little bit generous. Perhaps a diving bell would be more suitable. It's a little bit hard to determine exactly what to call it, as we have some rather conflicting sources. We have a source saying that the Nautilus is operational, seaworthy, and relatively reliable, and we have other sources from the Dwarf Army book stating that it was more or less a failed experiment. It sunk alright, but it didn't really get back up again, so believe what you will on that account. But, Arch, you might ask, if they have access to steam engines, and they have access to stuff like, well, dwarf gyrocopters, shouldn't this mean that they are relatively far advanced as far as technology goes? I mean, they've been at this level for 1,000 years at this point. Why haven't they advanced further? I mean, by all rights, an industrial revolution should have happened now, but it really hasn't. Well, that can be explained relatively simply by the simple fact that the dwarves are not big fans of innovation or change. For example, you've got the dwarf Gyrocopter. Now, the Gyrocopter was designed around the time of the War of the Beards, and while not working out all that well to begin with, in fact one of the first prototypes to be loaded with actual cargo smashed itself to pieces against a cliff wall, but oh well. The creator of the Gyrocopters kept labouring away at them, and eventually they became relatively trustworthy machines. Now, I have actually been asked the question, why gyrocopters? Why wouldn't the dwarves use steam-powered carts? Well, first of all, steam power wasn't actually invented at that point in dwarven history, and second of all, steam-powered carts sounds like a really good idea. I mean, it's essentially a truck, right? It would be really handy with the dwarves needing to ferry quite considerable amounts of supplies and trade commodities between the various holds. Except, you know, for the simple fact that the dwarves live in a massive-ass mountain range crawling with greenskins. So, the land route is usually not the safest or the most direct, so a gyrocopter simply makes a lot more sense from that perspective. Of course, there's also the argument to be made that, well, if they can figure out how to make a helicopter, surely they should figure out a way to make an armored vehicle, right? Just have the steam car armored up, make it literally an armored car, put a gun on it or something and you can drive right through the ambushes. Well, that assumes that warfare in the Warhammer world would evolve in the same way as in our world, which I don't think it's correct to assume. I mean, think about the armored vehicles in the Warhammer worlds, which were invented by the genius inventor Leonardo of Meragliano, or Leonardo da Vinci if you're not too keen on the whole nonsense names. Well, he created the steam tanks, which, okay, he made 12 of them, and the secret to make them has pretty much been lost after that. But 12 steam tanks, they didn't really have that much of an impact on the battlefield. Why, you might ask? They're bloody tanks. Certainly they must be pretty damn effective, right? Well, they're essentially just armored carts with a very, very, very simple main weapon. I mean, yeah, they're scary. They can probably crush a ton of infantry beneath them, but it's not really going to have that much effect on the battlefield, and it's monstrously expensive to make and maintain. It's just simpler to build a bunch of cannons, really. I mean, the reason why tanks became a thing in our world was the simple fact that building more cannons just didn't work. We tried building more cannons during World War I. We tried lobbing millions of tons of shells at the enemy, and, well, it didn't work, so we had to figure out something else. The Warhammer world has not found itself in that predicament. Good old-fashioned melee troops with swords, halberds, and ranged units with longbows and handguns are doing the job just fine. As such, there is no pressing need to innovate, and as we have seen in our own history, if there is no real need to innovate, well, we can't really be bothered. I mean, hell, think of our own history for a moment, yeah? We fought with swords and spears for millennia. We could have developed gunpowder weapons far earlier. The Chinese did. There's no reason why we couldn't have, but, well, why? You've got to remember that even gunpowder weapons are problematic. The main reason why gunpowder weapons supplanted longbows as the favoured ranged weapon was the simple fact that a longbowman takes years, if not decades, to train and craft into the level of physical fitness required to fight actively with a longbow. Not to mention aiming the damn thing over that kind of distances and firing it repeatedly. Those things are tough to draw. I've actually tried one, and yeah, I'd be lucky to get off about 3 arrows before I was puffing and wheezing into the ground. A musket, however, well, you require minimal training how to use that. You basically need only be taught how to load the thing, point it in the general direction of the enemy, and pull the trigger en masse, and that's it. It was a hell of a lot quicker to train people to use it. As such, it became a hell of a lot more effective weapon. Simply because if one side had 200 longbowmen and the other side had 2,000 musketmen, the muskets would win. And it's much the same in the Warhammer world as far as technology goes when it comes to weapons, because, well, weaponry is one of the driving forces when it comes to innovation in the Warhammer world. The dwarves have, at this point, kind of given up non-military pursuits when it comes to technology. They've created some steam-powered forges and other such things, but those are primarily used again to create weapons. The Dwarf Ironclad is most definitively a weapon. The Nautilus was also designed primarily as a weapons platform. The Gyrocopter, originally intended to be primarily a means of ferrying goods, got turned into what is it now, which is primarily a weapons platform. Larger versions designed for hauling goods still exist and are still being built, but, well, it's all well and good to haul a bunch of food to a dwarf hold, but it's somewhat problematic if the dwarf hold has already fallen to greenskins, if you get my drift. Oddly enough, the only real force of innovation in the Warhammer universe comes not from the good guys. The Empire's kind of stuck in a rut. They have the basics of steam engine technology. They use steam-driven river rafts. They even use it in some of their weapons. They have stuff like the steam tanks, although they can't build them anymore, and they've got reasonably effective cannons, mortars, and large siege equipment. They've certainly figured out how to use the basics of the technology, but, well, there really is no real urge to evolve their technology. It's not even completely certain that they have the skills. I mean, I'm diverging here from the point I was actually going towards, but I'll get to it sooner or later. Look at the Hellblaster volley gun, for example. The Hellblaster volley gun is not an innovation, should I say. It's not something new and genius. It's not a evolvement of the cannon. It's just more cannons. You see? The same with many of the handguns. I mean, you've got basic handguns, then you have repeater handguns, which is literally just more barrels on the same chassis. Not much of a revolution, is it? And as far as public transport goes, well, steam-driven river barges is about as far as they've gotten. The Empire, although they would have benefited far more from steam-driven carts than the Dwarves, well, they haven't really developed anything along those lines. They have not even developed trains, which the Dwarves have, but, well, the Dwarves, well, they're certainly on friendly terms with the humans, there's no denying that, but they're not that friendly. They don't quite trust the humans to pay the debt necessary to actually build them a functioning steam train, nor are they entirely convinced that the puny humans would make proper work of it. But back to what I was originally going towards. The greatest force of innovation is not the good guys. It's not the dwarf, it's not the Empire, it certainly isn't the elves, and it most definitively isn't Bretonia, who consider technology to be ever so slightly heretical. Well, except for that trebuchet thingy, because that's pretty damn good for knocking over stone walls, so we'll give that a slide. But the primary force for innovation in the Warhammer world, well, I'm assuming that they're still canon the way they used to be, but it is the Chaos Dwarves. Now, I know a lot of you have told me that they have a technical army book in the Forge world, Chaos Dwarves, but I'm not a huge fan of the Forge world version because it turned the Chaos Dwarves into something else. I prefer the older version, the ones where they looked like Mesopotamians and all of that. That looked actually really fantastic in my opinion. The new ones, they just look like spiky dwarves to me, which I'm not such a huge fan of. But anyways, the Chaos Dwarves encourage innovation because, well, they need to survive. They have even attempted to automate some of the factories with varying degrees of success, but at least they've made the effort. They have created golems to do some of the more labor-intensive work for them. Now, whether or not these golems could measure up to those created by the dwarves of old, I really don't know because I don't have that much information about those golems, but they certainly work as far as a basic labor goes. And of course, the Chaos Dwarves have invented a wide variety of weapons. And in this case, it's not just like the Empire of the Hellblaster volley gun, which is just more cannons. They've created all kinds of different artillery pieces, from giant bombard mortars that require ogres to load them, to hell cannons, which are, well, bound demons, essentially to fire the pure stuff of chaos, to rocket artillery, to flamethrower artillery, to just good old-fashioned cannons, to what are essentially assault guns. They have, well, the Chaos Dwarves are probably the ones that have come the closest to creating what we would be considering tanks by modern reckoning, and even then they are relatively crude pieces, little more than armoured weapon carriers, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. Again, though, the simple fact is that with all of the labour required to create a single tank, you could probably equip a couple hundred warriors with good old-fashioned swords and shields and armour, and, well, those few hundred warriors are probably going to do more to fight off the 2,000 greenskins howling at your door than the one tank. Now, I suspect a few of you might bring up the point that, well, warfare breeds innovation, right? I mean, look at the human race. I personally maintain that warfare is one of humanity's greatest inventions, and before you jump to the downvote button, allow me to elaborate on that point. So, war. It's a horrible thing. We all know that. Terrible things happen in war. People go kind of crazy in war and start doing shit that they wouldn't even consider doing in peacetime. And a lot of really, really, really nasty stuff happens. On the other hand, when large nations are at war with each other, technology skyrockets. Now, this held less true back in the Dark Ages, the Medieval Ages, the Ancient Ages, simply because, again, dudes with swords were, well, all you really needed. Even then, though, technological advancements gave certain nations considerable advantages over their enemies. Just look at Rome, for example, with their development of body armor. It was vastly superior to pretty much everything their enemies could bring at them, not to mention the fact that they realized that, well, if you slash a dude with a slashing weapon, odds are he's going to live, and he's probably even going to keep fighting. If you stab the bastard, well, the odds suddenly turned the other way around in a rather dramatic way. Technology. But particularly in the modern era, when we have reached that amount of people that is required for innovation to really start taking hold. The First World War had us go from marching in lockstep in large bothersome columns with people still volley firing each other's, getting gunned down by machine guns, to armoured warfare, combined arms with air, naval and land forces. And the Second World War, again, revolutionized the way we fight. However, technology will only advance at this rapid rate as long as there is a war to be won, so to say. In the Warhammer world, that is not always the case. The simple fact is that, okay, you've beat off the greenskins away from your borders. Great. Now what? They're gonna come back. I mean, you could launch a crusade into the Darklands and try and wipe out the orcs if it weren't for the fact that, you know, you're being threatened on 6 other fronts. Look at the Empire. The Empire cannot win a lasting peace. They are constantly set upon by guerrilla elements of beastmen within their own borders, constantly being raided by orcs, by chaos forces, by their lesser neighbours in the border princes. Occasionally they're at war with Bretonia, occasionally they have skirmishes with the elves, occasionally they even fight the dwarves. I mean, it's not a environment that is overly conducive to creative thinking, if you get my drift. And so, technology in the Warhammer world has been pretty much stationary for the last 1,000 odd years. Now, granted, part of that, undoubtedly, is a bit of laziness on the part of Games Workshop, who decided to just never advance the storyline until they decided, okay, you're bitching at us to advance the storyline, are you? Well, we're just gonna blow up the entire world then, so fuck you, I suppose. Games Workshop. Well, you certainly can't criticize them for not committing to an idea, I suppose. That made me think of Age of Sigmar. Now I'm depressed again. So, I'm trying to get to the end of my little rant here anyways, so it's probably for the best. To sum it up briefly, while there has been technological advancements in the Warhammer world, they are very, very rare and very far between. The Chaos Dwarves, being the most technologically advanced, are not particularly keen to share their technological advancements, and besides, the vast majority of them are weapons, and considering the Chaos Dwarves are fighting pretty much everybody, the last thing they are going to do is go and visit the Empire and go, hey, would you bastards love to buy a bunch of rocket launchers? No, of course not. That would be rather silly. The Dwarves, much like the Empire, are kinda too busy building the stuff they know will actually keep them alive to really try and innovate all that much. There is still innovation happening within the Dwarf Empire, but again, Dwarven resources are precious and stretched thin, and that is why even the most promising of innovations are going to take decades, if not centuries, of testing before it can be used as an accepted design and mass-produced. And the Empire? Well, they have the colleges that are working on new and interesting technologies, but again, it's pretty much all weapons, and since they're basically only working with very, very, very basic technology, they're working with bronze and iron casting, black powder, and a very limited understanding of steam power, there's only so much they can do, and again, there's only so much resources the Empire can actually dedicate to this. They need to be making cannons, they need to be making swords, crossbows, and handguns and suits of armor to, keep themselves alive. Now, with all of that said, however, bear in mind that this is, after all, a fantasy universe, and there are certain inventions that simply can't be explained by the level of technology. For example, the mechanical horse, which, good luck getting that to run on steam power. But, like I said, fantasy universe. Some of this stuff is not going to make a whole lot of sense. And many of the weapons invented at the College of Engineers is, eccentric, shall we say. Like, for example, the Pigeon Bombs, which are, pigeons with bombs strapped to them, because, why not? The problem with that design was, one, the pigeons like to return home with the bomb still attached, and secondly, every time they actually managed to train a pigeon to not come home, they just had to start over again since they hadn't really figured out a bomb-dropping mechanism. So while I do say that the Empire is working with relatively basic technologies, do bear in mind that, like I said, fantasy, magical universe, so there are some things that cannot be qualified within those relatively simple boundaries. The High Elves have pretty much just ignored the whole technology game because, they have magic. They don't really have that much need for technology. I mean, why bother with inventing electricity if your house is kept warm and illuminated by fairies? So, that's another thing. And the Bretonnians, they don't really like technology all that much. They consider it dishonorable, so don't expect any large technological innovations to be popping out of Bretonnia, if we should ever see another iteration of Warhammer, which we might. I mean, with Creative Assembly essentially owning the IP at this point, they could very well do whatever the hell they wanted, so all hope is not yet lost. So, I said at the beginning of this video that I was trying to make it a bit short, and, well, I can't with all due conscience call this short, but by my standards this wasn't too bad, as far as relatively incoherent rants go. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.